Okay, great. So thank you everyone for joining us for our event today. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day to learn and talk more about racism in housing. My name is Brooke and I'm the co-vice president of Trinity's chapter of Habitat for Humanity. Myself and Archana, the other co-vice president, as well as our president Ananya, will give you all a short background about the topic and we'll be introducing our speakers today. Before I start, I want to give a brief disclaimer that we will be recording this event and we'll be putting this on our social media. So if you are uncomfortable with that, please feel free to turn off your camera. And we ask that everyone turns off their microphone to reduce background noises as the speakers are presenting. So the purpose of the following facts and figures are to provide context for the current condition of the racial wealth gap in the United States. According to the Brookings Institute, before COVID-19, the median Black household's wealth was about $24,000, while the median white household's wealth was about 8 times that amount, so $188,000. During the 2007 recession, even though white households held higher levels of wealth compared to Black households, the decline in median wealth for both were nearly equal. Even in its aftermath, white households began recovering what they had lost, while the wealth of Black households continued to decline, a factor which left them more vulnerable to the current COVID-19 recession.
Hi everyone, I would just like to add a few things on what Brooke just said. So we all know that buying a nicer home in a nicer neighborhood is one of the easiest way to climb the socioeconomic ladder in the United States and has been a significant way for families to build wealth. But Black families have historically been deprived of this opportunity, which is why housing is as tremendous a factor in racial wealth disparity as it is. Houses in Black neighborhoods are devalued across the country, which is reflected in the corresponding racial wealth disparity. Such differences are direct results of segregation, redlining, and legal housing discrimination, which were continued, perpetuated, and lawful because of an overwhelmingly present culture of white supremacy. Though laws may have changed today, the value of schools, homes, neighborhoods, and land is still linked to a very prevalent white supremacist and racist perception of the people who occupy them. To talk and learn more about this, we have two great speakers today who will discuss the history of racism in housing and some of the ways it manifests today. So I'd like to ask Ananya to introduce our speakers, please.
So as Archana mentioned, to talk about this topic, we're joined by two speakers, Taniqua and Nick, who both do extremely relevant work with this issue, and so will be great resources for us to learn from. So Taniqua Hughley is originally from Queens, New York, and she graduated from Trinity in 2015 with a degree in sociology, and then in 2017 with a master's in public policy. She received a Fulbright Scholar Research Grant where she focused on girls in the criminal justice system in Trinidad and Tobago, specifically focusing on factors that led them to be incarcerated. At Trinidad and Tobago, she also set up a financial literacy program, which is still in effect today. She is a secretary for Trinity's Alumni Association, a governance board member from NILA and the I.W. Wells Senior Housing Facility in Hartford. She recently received a citizen diplomacy grant from the US State Department, which allowed her to establish Black Girls Achieve, which is a program aimed at providing Black girls with social, academic, and advocacy skills. And Taniqua is a Hartford's finest 100 Women of Color and Trinity's 50 for the Next 50 award recipient. She currently works in Hartford as the Outreach Director of Open Communities Alliance, which is a Connecticut-based civil rights organization that focuses on desegregating housing in Connecticut. We also have Nick Abbott. Nick is originally from Greenwich, Connecticut. He graduated from Harvard in 2018 with a degree in social studies, where he got to focus on housing policy, urban planning, and residential segregation. And he's currently a student at Harvard Law, earning his JD. So Nick has had experience in local and national level governmental departments, such as the Department of Justice, Department of Housing and Urban Development, City and County of San Francisco, the New York City Economic Development Corporation, Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and with political campaigns as well. In addition to being a law student, Nick is also a legal fellow at Desegregate Ct. So Desegregate Connecticut is a coalition of neighbors and nonprofits who strive to create abundant and diverse housing with the aims of equity and inclusive prosperity. So with that, I think we can get started. And Taniqua is going to give us a bit of background on this issue also talk a little bit about her own personal experience with it, and then Nick will continue on after her.
Okay, awesome. Do I have, can I please have the screen sharing capability?
Yes, let me just do that.
Okay. And we're all set. So good afternoon. Thank you to the Trinity Habitat for Humanity chapter for allowing me to share my knowledge today. It's always great coming back to Trinity in some shape or form, although it's not in person. So as Ananya said, my name is Taniqua Hughley. I'm the class of 2015 and also the class of 2017. And so today I'll talk a little bit about the history of racism in housing. First, I'll talk a little bit about my personal experience with racism in housing, and then I'll go on to talk a little bit about the history of housing policy and segregation and how housing segregation is not accidental. So I was born and raised in Queensbridge houses located in New York City. I was there my entire life until 2011, until I came to Hartford to attend Trinity. And so I'll talk a little bit about the history of Queensbridge so you can have a little bit of context as to why I decided to study sociology and why I'm in the housing field now. So in 1934, the New York State Legislature passed a bill to create NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority. And the purpose of NYCHA was created for the clearance, replanning, and reconstruction of the city slum districts. Mayor LaGuardia wanted to provide low-income families with decent living opportunities at that time. And so in 1939, Queensbridge houses were officially open. There were 6 super blocks and a total of 96 buildings. Until this day, Queensbridge is the largest housing development in the country with those 96 buildings. When the developments were first created, potential tenants had to provide proof of income, insurance, bank accounts when applying to the development. And obviously, many families did not have those things at the time. There were also, I think, 21 additional non-desirability categories in the tenant evaluation process, meaning if applicants were single parents, teen parents, widows, drug abusers, or had an irregular history of working, they were not admitted to live in any of the housing developments. Fortunately, this was amended in the 1960s. In 1972, Pruitt-Igoe houses in St. Louis were demolished. So Pruitt-Igoe, if anyone knows, it was known for the poverty and crime in St. Louis, and it kind of set the stigma for what public housing was and looked like across the nation. And then in the 80s, crime was on a rise and drugs infested Black communities. So you can see here on this graph, on this pie chart, that the demographics changed in the 60s drastically. So in 1941, when Queensbridge was first established, there were only about 1%, a little over 1% of Black tenants, and then that changed. And even today, it's definitely the Blacks are the predominantly is the predominant race. Excuse me. And so in the 1990s, 1996, 1997, several housing authorities adopted the one strike, you're out rule, which unfortunately Queensbridge residents supported. And so that meant that if there was someone in the household who committed a crime on housing grounds, they were then up for eviction. So what happened a lot in the 80s, there were just to put it in context, this is a Black community, concentrated poverty, people are unemployed and some people are homeless. So if there was a teenage boy arrested for loitering or selling drugs to make money to care for their family, that caused his mother, say if he lived with his mother, to then be evicted, meaning he and his siblings would then be out of a home. And so Long Island City, if anyone knows anything about Long Island City, it's a tale of two neighborhoods. So you have the largest housing development located right under one of the most used bridge, Triborough Bridge. It's only 5 minutes from Manhattan and it's next to a huge Con Ed plant over here, which you can see those red and white buildings in the back. And then the left picture, you can see the beautiful cityscape of New York City and Manhattan. But this is not unusual. Most landfills, highways, and power plants are located close to neighborhoods where the majority of the residents are poor, where concentrated poverty is. So Long Island City is actually known to have the worst population in the borough of Queens. And so we'll talk a little bit about the connection between housing, race, and health as well. And just to move on a bit, in 2001, Long Island City had a rezoning plan, which was implemented, and that led to gentrification. There was an influx of hotels built in the neighborhood. So there was good money that came from it. However, in any type of situation, there's always some good and bad when you have to talk, when you're dealing with development. So there was an increase in police interaction. So racial profiling went up, especially at the time when there was stop and frisk, and police brutality was on a rise as well. And there was just an overall increase of police presence in the development. And so just a few blocks away, there's a completely different type of neighborhood. So today people will know Long Island City specifically for the pier and the luxury apartments, and maybe even the Coca-Cola building sign, which is now located on Google. And I guess most recently, something to talk about is that during the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, some of the hotels that were immediately in the parameter of the Queensbridge houses were replaced to be rehabilitation centers and homeless shelters because of COVID-19 and the spacing that they needed. Unfortunately, this has only negatively impacted the neighborhood, and there are hundreds, thousands of hotels and spaces throughout New York City, but yet these shelters were placed in Queensbridge houses where there's already concentrated poverty. And that has been impacting the community as well. It's been garbage and litter all around, again, the police presence, and then just overall, you see homeless people and drug abusers on the street. And so the location of Queensbridge has always had its pros and cons, but mainly cons due to the various social struggles that residents face. And so overall, I'll talk a little bit about opportunity throughout this time. I was fortunate to have opportunities that I did. I was bused to thriving schools in the next neighborhood in Astoria. I was enrolled in college prep programs, and my mom was a city worker. She just recently retired from the New York City Housing Authority. So she knew how NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority, was supposed to treat their residents. She also had access and knowledge to all of these opportunities that our neighbors didn't have. So all of these opportunities allowed me to go off to Trinity and succeed. And I just couldn't have this particular conversation without sharing that with Trinity students, knowing the very stereotypes that students and professors have about people that look like me and people that come from neighborhoods such as Queensbridge and Hartford. And so there are a ton of studies that show that the access to opportunity leads to upward mobility, and I am a living testament to that. I won't get into the studies, but I'm happy to share some in the chat if you need. So now I'll move on to talk a little bit more about the history of segregation in Connecticut and Hartford. So Connecticut is one of the most segregated states in the country. We're more segregated than some states in the South. This is shaped by zoning, subsidized housing, limits on housing jurisdiction, disinvestments, and just the overall policies, which Nick and I will talk about. So a lot of people talk about the achievement gap, but we fail to really look at the overall picture of the factors that influence a person's life. So I talk about the opportunity gap, so educational indicators, economic indicators, and just the overall neighborhood resources and quality is what shapes someone's opportunity, access to opportunity. And I'll show you a little bit what that looks like. In OCA's Out of Balance report, we talk about opportunity in Connecticut. We look at how opportunity impacts race and how all of these things are intersectional. I can also share the link to this report as well. So this is a distribution of opportunity in Connecticut. OCA worked with a few partners to create these maps that show the stark difference between opportunity levels in the state of Connecticut. There are five, different levels of opportunity rating, from very low to very high. The darker orange represents thriving towns. So these are areas with low poverty, low crime, high employment rates, and thriving schools. This is a distribution of people of color and opportunity in Connecticut. 1 dot equals 250 people of color. So just pay attention to where you see all of the concentrated numbers. So you'll see that in Hartford, Waterbury, Bridgeport, Stamford. And that obviously correlates with where very low opportunity areas are identified. So where do we live? 73% Blacks and 73% Latinos live in what's considered the low and very low areas of Connecticut, compared to 26% whites and 36% Asians. So this is the opportunity map with the location of subsidized housing units in Connecticut placed right on top. And so again, you can see the relationship between where the low and very low opportunity areas are and where housing subsidized units are. This is the location of the tenant-based subsidies in Connecticut. This is the RAP program, the Rental Assistance Program, which is funded by the state and state-run. And unfortunately, this program, the state's program, is the most segregated in the state. Again, you see that correlation of where people of color live and where these subsidies are located. So this is a closer view on Hartford in particular. This is, again, the opportunity map, but with the health disparity and opportunity in Hartford. So racism has been identified as a public health crisis. Some of us knew that already. Just more recently, in the state of Connecticut, you saw different cities declaring racism a public health crisis. And it's kind of like, well, yeah, we knew that, right? And so this is here where the green dot is located. This is Hartford. And then this orange area here, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but the orange area on the right, the lower right, is Glastonbury. So just a town over, the life expectancy rate and the asthma rate in low and very low opportunity areas are just not, and these areas are not comparable at all. So in low and very low opportunity areas, you'll find higher asthma rates and lower life expectancy rates compared to suburban towns such as West Hartford, Newington, Glastonbury, and Wethersfield, and in this case, Glastonbury. And so 2% of the land area of the state is identified as very low. More than half, so 52% and 50%, more than half of Blacks, 52%, and then half of the Hispanics in the state live in these very low identified areas. So out of all of the state, only 2% is considered very low, yet half of the race of Black folks live in very low areas. So I'll get in to talk about Hartford really briefly. Hartford was once the richest city in the capital. It was the financial center, the insurance capital, home to Mark Twain and Harriet Beecher Stowe, and that's not the case today. I encourage you to check out Professor Jack Doherty's ebook with his students online called On the Line, which talks a lot about Hartford. This is a glimpse of Hartford's racial change over the years. As you can see, Hartford became the hub of concentrated poverty within the county. So a drastic change from 1950 to 2010. I'm interested, Nick, I know you probably are, to see the new census numbers. So today, most of Hartford's neighborhoods have poverty concentration greater than 20%, which also indicates that the neighborhood has higher crime rates. If you're not familiar with the different neighborhoods in Hartford, Trinity is in the Behind the Rocks area. So yeah, as you can see, unfortunately, Hartford went from one of the richest cities in the capital, one of the richest cities in the world, and the capital of the state, to being a hub of concentrated poverty. So housing segregation is not accidental. As you can see here, systemic racism impacts the lives of Black and brown people in more ways than you can even imagine. There have been deliberate policies in place that perpetuated racism, such as redlining. In the 1930s, banks denied Black families financial services and loans when they attempted to purchase homes in certain neighborhoods. Places where Black families and immigrants lived were given low ranks, which made it much harder for them to purchase, to live in neighborhoods that they wanted, and much harder to receive the assistance that they needed to live in those neighborhoods. Zoning has played a big role in housing segregation, and it still does. In 1926, the court endorsed the right of a municipality to use zoning as a way to block multifamily housing. And this practice is still relevant today in Connecticut. And this was a result of the Euclid v. Ambler case. Racial covenants were placed in the deeds of houses. This is a restrictive covenant from Highledge Homes in West Hartford, just over where many Trinity students go. And it reads, "No person of any race except the white race shall use or occupy any building on any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupy by domestic servants of a different race employed by an owner or tenant." As a result of the Shelley v. Kramer case in 1948, the Supreme Court ruled that this practice was unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. In many cases, even if a Black family successfully purchased a home, there was still some type of covenant on that home. For example, I know someone whose family purchased a home, but unfortunately they can't make changes to the home or even sell the home without the green light from the white family who they purchased the home from. So the Fair Housing Act. In 1968, Congress passed a critical civil rights law, the Fair Housing Act, which bans discrimination in most housing advertising, and even housing related services, such as the home loans that I spoke about. The Fair Housing Act protects against housing segregation, and it also supports investments in Black and brown communities. In Connecticut, we're fortunate to have the protections of two sets of fair housing laws, the Federal Fair Housing Act and the State Human Rights and Opportunity Statute. These laws protect characteristics aside from race, and those are called protected classes. So sex, national origin, disability, familial status, and more. And so, yes, I wanted to share that briefly. So I'll just begin to wrap up and pass it on to Nick. These are a few suggested reads that I have: Race for Profit by Keeanga Yamata Taylor, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, American Apartheid by Doug Massey, A Steady Habit of Segregation report. This is a recent report released by OCA and Susan Eaton and a few other partners, which focuses a lot on Hartford. The Out of Balance report produced by OCA, which I shared earlier, and the On the Line ebook produced by Professor Jack Doherty. So though laws such as the Fair Housing Act was implemented, we still have a long way to go. Today we're advocating to, close up those loops that lead to segregation in our countries, particularly in the state of Connecticut. And we know that Connecticut has a long history of segregation. I'm proud to work alongside my colleagues at OCA to tackle these issues. I'm glad there's another group out here also doing the work and raising awareness to these issues. So to the Trinity students, I challenge you to get involved in the community, continue to learn about where you live for 4 years, take a class that addresses these injustices, learn about the intersectionality of these social issues, and take action during your time at Trinity. Thank you. So I'll pass it on now.
Well, thank you so much for that's a hard act to follow. That was tremendous. Can I also share my screen? I'm not sure if I have that capability yet. Let's see. Oh, yes, I do. Okay, great. All right, so my name is Nick Abbott. I'm part of Desegregate Connecticut. Following up on Taniqua's tremendous presentation, I'm going to be talking a little bit about one aspect of this problem, although by no means the entirety of it, which is the land use or the zoning aspect that she touched on in her presentation. And there are lots of other pieces that go into this, from investments in housing vouchers, building more affordable housing, where we build affordable housing, that feed into segregation and other housing inequalities. But I'm going to be focusing in particular on zoning and land use as kind of one piece of this larger picture. So first off, just a little bit about the group that I'm part of, Desegregate Ct. We're a new group that's formed over the summer. That's a coalition of lots of other groups, essentially trying to change our land use laws. And our group really starts from the fundamental premise that our land use laws, thinking about zoning, and I'll get into a little bit more about what that actually means, creates segregation, and that we need to change those in order to provide for a more equitable state. And these are just some of our the groups that are increasingly awakening to this reality here, that it's really long before our group formed, have been doing this important work. And in addition to these, the Open Communities Alliance has been doing tremendous work in this area to drum up public awareness of these issues and actually do the work to start to change some of the most pernicious policies that are segregating our state. And as I said, one of the great things I think about being in this particular moment is that there's a recognition that we need to address housing, and that at the heart of, and in addition to lots of other issues that are surrounding racial inequality, and I think the pandemic has laid bare, and obviously recent instances of police brutality have laid bare, that there are systemic issues we need to address. And one of the foremost of those, particularly here in Connecticut, is housing. So there are kind of three buckets of things that we think justify or really make clear the need for change. And in this presentation, I'm going to focus mainly on equity, but I also think there's important, economic and environmental considerations that overlap with the core equity need to change our zoning laws and the way in which we decide what can be built where and where we allow housing. So the first thing that I want to start with, and Taniqua covered this extremely well in her presentation, so I don't need to dive into all of the history as much, is that segregation not only exists across the country, but is particularly bad in Connecticut. For as much as we may think of Connecticut as a liberal place, it's much more segregated than places we might historically think of as more racist or something like that, having a more difficult history with this stuff. Connecticut, according to a lot of work, and Taniqua highlighted this in her presentation, is among the most segregated states in the country. And Fairfield County in particular, which is where I come from, is the most income segregated place in the entire country. And that income segregation also is correlated with a high degree of racial segregation as well, where our neighborhoods are not diverse at all. And we have concentrations of poverty or concentrations by race as well. And what this particular graphic, which is a little bit dense, so I want to walk you through a little bit, shows it's not just that this is lingering from the past. The history of redlining obviously set us on the course we are today, but in many ways, we are becoming more segregated. And what this shows is that of the 20 metropolitan areas in the United States that have become more segregated over the course of the past 50 years, 3 of the ones that have seen the biggest increase are all in Connecticut. So the 3 metropolitan areas in Connecticut, the New Haven area, the Bridgeport, Stamford area, and the Hartford area, have become more segregated by income, and thus also we've seen by race over time. Even though we like to think that, in the wake of the Fair Housing Act and other important legislation or court decisions that we're getting better, in many ways the outcomes show that we're actually getting much worse. One key part of this that I think is really important for this audience and that really drew me into these conversations is the effect that exclusionary zoning and housing segregation can have on educational inequity. So we know that exclusionary zoning, which starts off from the premise saying you can't build apartment buildings here, or you can't build the sort of dense housing that is going to be more affordable for people, or you can't build subsidized housing in a particular town, leads to higher housing costs, where the resulting housing you may get in a particular town is only going to be large mansions on 2 acres of land, pricing out sorts of people who could only afford a studio or a 1-bedroom apartment. And as a result, we see that families that can only afford to live in an apartment or in subsidized housing versus those that live in more expensive housing send their children to different schools. And those schools get different amount of resources that are funded by property taxes. And therefore, we see a huge achievement gaps and opportunity gaps in terms of the education that students here in Connecticut are getting. So this graphic helps to point out some of that. So the median home value of home in an area with A-rated schools is worth almost twice as much as what it is for a home in an area near bad schools. And there's a bit of a loop here, a cause and effect where it's mutually reinforcing, where if you have housing that's near good schools, then that housing is going to be more desirable and have a higher price attached to it. And then you see what we see from those communities is that they oftentimes close off access to those communities through restrictive zoning and other measures to try and keep out lower income people and the sorts of housing that those people could live in from their communities, exacerbating the effects of educational inequity. And what we see in this graph, this is from a Brookings Institute report, which shows that the housing cost gap, that is, the difference that it would cost, the difference in cost to attend or to get a house in an area with A-rated schools versus lower-rated schools is much higher in areas, in that kind of far right of that graphic. It's much higher in areas with more restrictive zoning. And this makes sense because if a town is limiting the amount of housing you can build there, or what types of housing you can build there, then as a result, what you're going to see is that it's more expensive then for somebody to access the sorts of communities that are offering the most opportunities through their public schools to students. And so this housing cost gap that I talked about, the difference that it would cost to get a house in a school district with high performing schools versus a district with low performing schools, is at the highest of any metropolitan area in Connecticut. Of any metropolitan area in the country, the Bridgeport metropolitan area in Connecticut has the highest housing cost gap in the country, which has all sorts of downstream effects on the students who live there and the opportunities they're afforded later on in life. And this shows, continues to show that at a test performance level, the levels of segregation. And I can get into more of the data on that, but I don't want to get too bogged down in that discussion here, but happy to answer any more questions about the education piece of this. Briefly, we also know that land use, law, and zoning has economic effects. So in particular, by restricting the amount of housing or the type of housing you can build in an area, it locks in an aging population and makes it inaccessible for younger people, for racially diverse people, for people with lower incomes to access an area and access all the opportunities that come along with that, from jobs to social services and others. And then lastly, there's part of this that I think has large, equity consequences based on some of the, the history of environmental racism that Shaniqua talked about a little bit, which is that our current zoning policies hurt the environment tremendously. That by saying we can only build large single-family homes instead of, denser housing near transit, we force more housing further out into our open space, into our forests. And we force people into their cars for longer, where they're emitting more and taking up more energy, which has very drastic environmental consequences. This is a graphic from the Connecticut Land Use, from a Land Use Institute at the University of Connecticut, And this shows how we've sprawled outward from our cities and have taken up more and more land as a result of our land use policies that dictate where we can develop and how we do that, pushing us further and further into the open space and compromising our forests and our agricultural lands. So one thing that our group has really done, and we've really benefited from the work that's being done by other groups like the Open Communities Alliance and others, is to try to research what is the status quo of regulation and how can we improve upon it. So we've been looking into the zoning codes that every single municipality in Connecticut has. And municipalities zone their communities, they pass regulations to determine what housing they allow there, and oftentimes misuse this particular power, oftentimes maybe out of good intentions, oftentimes out of really bad intentions to try and keep people out of their communities. And what we found through looking at 2,600 of these different zoning districts that exist throughout Connecticut is that we see towns that set what are called high minimum lot sizes, saying you can't build a house on a small lot, which would be more affordable, but that if you want to build a house, it has to be on 2 acres or more than that often. They ban more than 1 unit on a given parcel of land, which means you can't build apartments there, making it so that the only housing you have there, as I said, are large single-family homes. And what we've seen is that as we do more historical research to situate, the current situation, we see a fairly typical history of zoning in a particular suburbs. This is based off of my hometown of Greenwich. This is fairly typical for suburbs throughout the state, where we saw suburbs in the wake of World War II, oftentimes redlined, as Taniqua talked about in her presentation, grew a lot and developed their populations. But once we passed the Fair Housing Act and as restrictive covenants became unenforceable, we saw zoning come in as a way to try and restrict that growth and restrict the diversification of the suburbs to try and lock in their populations as is. And we see this is particularly troubling, I think, in the COVID pandemic, where we've seen towns erect further walls. So for example, towns that have beaches have oftentimes restricted access to those beaches only to their residents in a way that they couldn't in normal times by, under state law. And we see that particularly when, the rubber meets the road, when we enter times of crisis, that it's really important to have integrated communities, because if we have segregated communities, those communities that have opportunities and resources and privileges oftentimes shut out those that aren't living there, which has really problematic consequences. Another big thing that we've been focusing on, and I don't want to get too much on this, is education. And we think that events like this are tremendous. And so I really want to commend everybody for showing up here to learn about these issues and to get involved with them. So we've been putting on events, a lot of which are on our website. So if you're interested in this stuff, I'd encourage you to take a look at some of our events, and all of which are recorded and are up if you'd like to take a look. As well as some data and reports if you're interested in learning more about this stuff. So I'm not going to get into all of the policy implications and things that we're getting into. What I will say is that we think that this requires the need for statewide reform, that we need as a state to look at some of the most harmful policies that are stopping new housing from being built, stopping a diversity of housing like multifamily buildings and apartment buildings and affordable housing from being built. And then we need to improve the process the processes that we employ, which oftentimes reflect reflect an exclusionary impulse, or even if they're well-intentioned, have the result of maintaining the existing status quo, which we know is unacceptable and is increasingly segregated. So thanks so much for listening to my presentation. I'd be happy to enter a discussion and to hear things from this group.
So thank you both Taniqua and Nick for both of your presentations. So like Nick said, we're going to open the sequence of the event to questions for our speakers. So if you don't want to turn your video, you don't have to, just turn on your mic and ready to go. We can begin with a question from us. So one of our questions was, as our capacity as college students, or as people who don't really work in organizations like both of yours, what are some ways in which we can get involved in the fight for racial justice in housing or be better advocates for this issue?
Nick, were you going to say something?
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a good question. Believe it or not, Trinity students have just as much power compared to residents of Hartford, because you are a resident of Hartford. So even if you're not interested in, hardcore advocacy, you could, one, learn. So education is key. That's where it starts, right? Because we often have our own preconceived notions and perspectives about race and racism overall. And Hartford, I went to Trinity, so I know it all. And it looks, so the fact that you all are involved in Habitat for Humanity, it tells me that you already took like a first step in having this conversation. But we know most of our peers at Trinity, most of your peers at Trinity are not interested in having these type of conversations. So continuing to push other students and faculty to discuss these issues. And I think it's also important to see how it relates to Trinity and students. But also if you can, register to vote. And participate in the local elections. Even if you are not able to vote, I say take part in the legislative session where you just contact the local legislator and say you should support this, or this is why this is important. I think that's helpful. But as I said, I think at the end of my presentation is tune in, take a class in one of the departments with a professor that is not racist, with a professor that knows their stuff, that will be transparent and challenge you to do the work. So I think that's a big start, because what happens is most college students, they go and they just stick to their major and take classes only in their major, explore and challenge yourself, because this is a hard issue. And this is life outside of college.
That was a great answer. The only thing I'll add to that is two things. So one, oftentimes what in your communities, whether it's where you're going to school now or where you're living after college or where you live when you're at home, there will be issues at the local level where you have a huge amount of ability to have an impact, way more than you're able to have at the federal level. And these decisions around, how our communities look are oftentimes made by very local boards. And oftentimes those boards aren't intentionally doing the wrong thing, but they don't hear the other side. So when somebody proposes to build, new affordable housing, they hear from all of the neighbors in the neighborhood that say, this is going to lead to traffic, and this is hurting the character of the community, or sometimes things that are a lot worse than that. And that's all they hear. And if you are able to show up and say, hey, I think this is a great thing for our community, and here's why, that can make a tremendous difference to even represent that side that's oftentimes not presented. The other piece, and this is very specific, is that if you're interested in this stuff as it relates to Connecticut, our group has lots of opportunities. We have a couple Trinity students actually that are doing research for us now on some of these issues and doing work as we are getting ready for the legislative session. So if that's something you're interested in, I'll leave my email in the chat and you can feel free to send me an email. And we are eager to have as many volunteers as we can get. So there's an interesting opportunity to do cool policy work, to meet with legislators, to get really involved in our group since we're kind of new and starting up. So if you're interested in that sort of stuff, but short of that, all the things that Taniqua said are tremendous ways to improve yourself and have an impact on those around you.
I think Leslie had a question.
Oh, thanks a lot. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for doing this, and thank you, Trinity. I'm Leslie Hammond. I am a realtor in Hartford. I have my own company, and I'm a community activist. And I'm blessed to know Taniqua and all her great work. I have a few questions actually, so any of them that you can answer would be great. One, I know Democrats have been in charge of Connecticut for a long time, so I'm really upset to see how we continue with these restrictive zoning laws, particularly on the shoreline, when I realized how much they approved some of this restrictive zoning that blocks us from using our water that, we all have the sound, but we can't get there, we can't park there, we can't go to the beach there. Secondly, I'd like to hear more about racism being a public health hazard. I know a lot of towns have said it is, but I'm concerned that it's just a nice statement and there's really no teeth behind it. And thirdly, not to overwhelm you guys, but I do a lot in Hartford with city council and everything. I'll put my email in the chat, and really students, anytime you just feel like, how is everything working in Hartford or not working, or I'll try not to be too cynical. I'll try to tell you some of the positive things, but there are definitely ways you can get involved and really make a difference, because it's a big city, but it's not that big a city because not that many people are speaking out. So if you guys got together on one issue, you really could make a difference. So thank you.
I guess I'll add to what Nick said previously. You hit the nail right on the head. Like, if you guys are interested in, just learning more, check out our websites. Both of our websites have like an overwhelming amount of information. We're both available to chat, and both of our organizations also offer research and internship opportunities. To get to Leslie's point, I'll start with the racism as a public health crisis. You are so right. Right now, like I said, cities are declaring racism a public health crisis, but that's nice, but what are you going to do, right? What action are you going to take? You're so right about that. Like, they're declaring it, but I haven't seen, and Nick, I'm not sure if you've seen, and if you did, please share, any mayors really say these are the steps that we're going to take, and we might see that during this session. I hope we see it during the session, but you're right. It's just we're going to do this. We're declaring this, but I haven't seen any action or backing behind it. And then your first question was about, remind me, what's your first question?
Well, about the zoning, I'm particularly interested in the shoreline. I've been down there recently. If you haven't been down there, just try to go to the beach and see all the no parking signs. You can't get there. They go, well, you can use our beach, but there's no place to park because there's no parking signs. And how did all that happen? How did we've had Democrats in charge for a really long time. And I know some of the zoning is even worse than that. Or just as bad. So I want to be hopeful, I really do, but I'm a little discouraged when I see how much got through under Democrats that supposedly care about this stuff, So anyway, give me some hope, guys.
Nick, you can add to this. Definitely, you'll know a lot more about the zoning laws than I do, but overall, from my amount of experience and knowledge, a lot of it, they can be Democrats, but that does not mean that they want people outside of their outside of their community to be in their backyard. Those are the NIMBYs, right? Not in my backyard. So though we have, Democrats are controlling the state, it's still hard because not all Democrats will support the things that Desegregate Ct or OCA proposes this session. And that's just the reality of it. There's a lot of othering when it comes to people's neighborhood and towns. And that's just what it comes down to, is that there isn't enough support in the Democratic congregation. So hopefully with some things that we are proposing this year, we can garner some support. And now that there's another organization talking about this, OCA is not the only organization trying to advocate for this. So maybe people will, take this a little more seriously and into consideration. Nick, I know you have something to add to that.
That was a great answer, and I think really covers kind of the entirety of the issue. There's something that was left in the chat by Ty. It was something I was thinking of, and as you were speaking, was looking up. There was a guy named Ned Cole in the 1960s who he was from Hartford. He was a civil rights leader in Hartford, and he led a movement of people to desegregate Connecticut's beaches, where on the coasts we had these beaches that were restricted only for the residents of those almost entirely white suburbs. And when they would stop him from coming in, he would sometimes invade them via a raft and would paddle around to invade those beaches. And to think that that was something that only 50 years ago was happening in Connecticut, and to a certain extent is still happening in Connecticut as we erect walls to our public resources, erect walls to be able to enter suburbs, both literally and in terms of being able to access those housing markets. It's really something that I love Connecticut. I grew up there. I hope to go back after graduating law school, but something that makes me really ashamed, and something that I'm hopeful that with all of the work that's being done from community groups, with increased interest from politicians and from, frankly, young people like you in our state, that I hope we can change and really make some progress on.
Yeah, well, since you guys brought it up, so Ned Cole was my ex-husband, and you guys have to look him up because he used to do beach landings in Madison. And then thankfully a lawyer, thank goodness for lawyers, he sued the town of Greenwich. You probably know this, Nick, or you should. So he sued the town of Greenwich because he went walking or jogging there, and he was a white guy, but he couldn't get access, and he was mad, and he was a young lawyer. So he sued the town of Greenwich. And I was at the court trial, and Ned was going to testify, for the lawyer. And the town of Greenwich had 3 lawyers, all high power lawyers. And there was this lone lawyer by himself suing the town. I mean, the visual, you've just got to look up the case if you don't want to read the whole book. And so Ned spoke, and he spoke about the poverty and everything. And the lawyers would say, well, if you have 1.5 million, you can come to our beaches. They literally said that. And they said, whatever Ned Cole's saying, it doesn't really have anything to do with anything because, you just have to buy a house here. And the judge let Ned finish. And Ned loved to talk, and especially loved to talk about something like this. And it was an amazing moment because the lawsuit won. So you can go to these beaches. Of course, unfortunately, you have to pay like $200 or buy, I think you can get in $50 a day or something ridiculous. But yeah, so they did open up the beaches. They had to, but they're still playing so many games. But, I do think the courts make a difference. And I know, Taniqua, your guys are involved with Woodbridge. So please, students, all be lawyers. It's the only way. Just like keep suing these guys. Thanks. Sorry to take up too much time, but it's an amazing piece of history.
One coda I'd add to that's a really helpful overview of the history is that just now we've seen, while the courts ruled that everyone should have access to these beaches, they're a public resource. During COVID, we saw towns say, well, because it's a public health crisis, because we don't overcrowding, now you can't get into the beaches anymore. And it really shows that, when push comes to shove, when the crisis comes, if we have segregated communities, the affluent communities are going to put their walls up, they're going to shut people out. And that's why we need to kind of get at the structural issue instead of, these sort of half measures to really get at the heart of these issues.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I guess we'll go again. We had another question that we were hoping to ask. I think this past year, I think for a lot of people has been more eye-opening than others, both in terms of racism in housing, racism in general, and then in terms of exposing structural inequalities in this country. And so looking forward, what do you think will be the biggest roadblocks to change? Do you think that the types of experiences that people have been exposed to this year will shift that a little bit, and how do you guys foresee change happening?
I'm happy to start off. You gave me all the time to think about the past ones. So, but that's obviously the $1 million, way more than that question of both, how do we engineer change and what are the obstacles to that change? I think what, particularly as applies to the issue of housing, and I think there's so much written about how do you change hearts and minds and these things in general, but I'm just going to talk particularly as it applies to housing, is so many of these decisions or these issues are not about what a majority of people think about them. Often, 95% of people, don't care about these things either way, or if they do, they're not going to show up to a given meeting to say, here's what I care about. The biggest obstacle is saying oftentimes that the 5% of people who care the most, or even less than that, the people who show up are the ones that, whether it be because of bigoted belief or just because they have another concern and they don't recognize the downsides that their actions have, that they're the ones that show up. And so I think one of the great things we saw this summer was a huge mobilization of people to show up to say, the normal ways in which we've made decisions don't represent what we want. So it's really about showing up and making sure that while I think we want to convince a majority of people, and I think we can, convince a majority of people, it's about the people showing up in the rooms where these decisions are being made and making their voice heard.
Yeah, I agree. I think, yeah, that is a tough question because there are so many factors to this. I think that these past 4 years, things have come to light, things that some people already knew. We knew that, Connecticut was racist. Connecticut, most of our surrounding suburban communities, we knew that a lot of politicians were, but these past 4 years just brought it all to light. However, I think that the events of last week is quite interesting and has opened the eyes to some people who may not have necessarily agreed with us. I say us as far as like supporters and allies. So it's interesting to see how Republicans are kind of making a distance from that type of behavior and racism. It could be just to save face, but overall, it seems like people are really thinking about these issues during COVID-19. There were people who were murdered by the police. So George Floyd, for example, who was killed, that situation kind of led a lot of people, non-Black people, and people of suburban communities to talk about the issues of racism, housing, police brutality, health, and COVID-19 definitely sparked that conversation as well. So this quarantine, this pandemic has been both a blessing and a curse. But I think this past year in itself has definitely opened the eyes of many people who may not even have to ever think about homelessness or the impact of health and race. So I'm interested to see what's going to happen. I don't know if I'm like as hopeful. I know that change will come. We have come a long way, but we have a long way to go. In Connecticut, in particular, I think we're going to see a lot of change in the next few years. Leslie mentioned litigation, something that OCA is a part of. Nick talked about briefly about various changes that our organizations are implementing. So it's going to take time, but I'm hopeful. I don't think it's going to happen right away. But then I'm someone who's like, yeah, they're going to do this, but then do this, right? So for example, the Fair Housing Act, but yet here we are today still talking about racism and segregation. So it's something to pay attention to. Especially, I'm not sure if you guys are up to date, but I'm sure Habitat in specific, in particular, will be impacted in some shape or form, whether that means that Habitat is now doing builds in suburban communities or money is being funneled away. So that's something to definitely pay attention to. But this year will be interesting to see. It'll be interesting to see what the Republicans advocate for during this session. So like I said, this was definitely a blessing and a curse.
Thank you both so much. Are there any last questions? I think we might have time for just about one more, but if not, we can close up. Okay, looks like there aren't any for now. So as we close this event, we want to especially thank both of you, Taniqua and Nick, for your generosity with your time and your expertise. Racial segregation and legal discrimination in housing represent pernicious ways in which white supremacy and racism continue to perpetuate. But the work that both of our speakers do through the Open Communities Alliance and Desegregate Connecticut are significant ways to combat these issues and support inclusive housing. In finding ways to be actively anti-racist and demand institutional change, one means of support is to donate to these organizations through their websites, where you can find you can also find resources on how to get involved and be an advocate in your community. You can also look at groups like the Poverty and Race Research Action Council and the National Fair Housing Alliance. Thank you again, Taniqua and Nick. This event has been incredibly informative and especially relevant. Thanks to all of your knowledge and work, and thank you to all of you who attended. We hope you've really enjoyed this event.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.